Hi, my name is Alin Popescu from Renesys, and I'm going to talk about the impact of the cable breaks in the Mediterranean and the Gulf from a global routing perspective. So what happened was that around January 30th, several cables in the Mediterranean and the Gulf were damaged. At least 3 cables were impacted, Flag, CME-V4, and Flag Falcon. Some were severed and some had power problems, but altogether they came down. The impacted regions were the Middle Eastern North African part, the Gulf, and the Indian subcontinent. And to give you a feeling, we had about 6,856 networks from 23 countries that suffered at least an outage during a 1-week period. And to tell you a little bit about this analysis, so Renesys data consists of BGP updates from over 250 peering sessions. We have about over 170 unique ASs. We have multiple sessions with some ASs in different geographic regions. And for the purpose of this presentation, we looked at 1 week after January 30th, and we limited the analysis to outages only. And what does this mean is that there are still prefixes that may not have been completely outaged that were impacted. In particular, a lot of networks suffered from reduced capacity and long latencies that caused BGP session resets because the TCP sessions were dying, and this generated some instability at BGP level. And also, in this analysis, we ignore countries with fewer than 5 prefixes, for example, Oman and Yemen. So to give you a better feeling for the geographies involved in this that were impacted by these cable breaks, I'm going to show you this map. And shown here we have the location of the cable breaks north of Alexandria and between Qatar and the Emirates. Countries that are shown in darker colors are countries that suffered more than 50%, countries for which 50% of their prefixes were outaged. So shown here is a time series graph of outages, of prefixes outaged over time for the day of January 30th. Shown in red is the Middle East, North Africa, in blue is the Indian subcontinent, and in yellow the Persian Gulf. The cable breaks, as far as we can tell, happened around 4:30 and 8 UTC time, but as you can see, it was a pretty troubled period with several events that we can see on this graph, particularly around 13 UTC, where you can see both the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent having a spike in outages. Here we have the same graph for a week from January 30th, and note a big spike in outages in the Middle East around February 2nd, which we believe corresponds to the problems with the Flag Falcon cable in the Persian Gulf. Here we have outages per countries shown as a histogram, and both in absolute value on the left and in percentage on the right. And the point I would like to make here is that while India had the most prefixes that were outaged, it was countries like Egypt, Maldives, Djibouti that suffered like a nearly 100% outage in terms of prefixes. So I'm going to take a little bit more time and look at Egypt in particular. Shown here is a time series of the outages for Egypt over a week. 95% of the prefixes suffered some outage during this period of time, which is 1,456 prefixes out of 1,502. And the main events that we distinguish are on January 30th, 4:30 and 8 UTC, and on February 2nd, an outage that took over 3 hours. So the main stories were that Telecom Egypt got several new providers, PCCW, France Telecom, and VSNL, Teleglobe, and It also picked routes from several Egyptian ISPs, Link.net, Riot Telecom, EGNet, and Nile Online, that dropped their main providers in favor of Egypt Telecom. And not unexpectedly, one of the cable operators' flag was significantly impacted. So to illustrate this better, I'm going to show you like a provider map for Egypt, showing here are Egyptian ASs and with their providers. The arrows go from customer to provider, so note that in this image the customers tend to be on top and the providers tend to be on the bottom. Shown on the bottom in yellow boxes are ASs that represent points of egress for the Egyptian traffic, and you can notice that they are all big global networks such as Flag, Verizon, UUNet, VSNL, Teleglobe. And the bigger nodes in the graphs represent the most important Egyptian ASs, and here in particular we show the Egyptian ASs that have more than 100 prefixes originated. And note also that we also show the number of prefixes originated in those boxes. The edge labels represent the difference in prefixes between February 7 and January 30th. So a positive number represents a gain and a negative number represents a loss. And we showed the thicker edges are edges that carry more than 100 prefixes as seen at some point during this time period. And in red, we show big losses, and in green we show new transit relationships, that is transit relationships that we have observed after January 30th. So what happened, as I was telling you before, we noticed how Telecom Egypt acts as a big hub for most of the other Egyptian ASs that tend to drop their main providers. For example, AS 20,858 EGNet seems to drop France Telecom. We see here a loss of 276 prefixes, and starts routing those prefixes through Telecom Egypt. The notable exception appears to be Flag, for which Link.net still routes a significant number through, but this is rather the exception. The other big ASs such as AS 15,475, Nine Online, Riot Telecom, they drop Flag and they start routing through Telecom Egypt. And note that also Telecom Egypt gets 3 new providers, VSNL, Teleglobe, PCCW, and France Telecom, and starts also routing a significant number of prefixes through Telecom Italia. Shown here are some time series of prefixes over time on edges that involve Telecom Egypt and its providers. On top are edges that have gained prefixes, and on the bottom edges that have lost prefixes. Each point on these graphs represents an 8-hour time interval, and it's the number of prefixes that we have seen in those intervals. So I'm not going to get into too many details here. I'll leave this for your reference. Shown here are also some time series for prefixes over time, the same as before, that involve the other big Egyptian ASs and their providers. And in general, the story here is that they tend to drop the big global networks in favor of Telecom Egypt. And to conclude this talk, so this event showed us that the internet is still vulnerable to disasters, and that comes to me as not something unexpected, since there is a natural trade-off between cost and reliability. Geography turns out to play a very important role. Cables break all the time in the North Atlantic, but since there are so many of them, nobody really notices. However, when cables break in geographic choke points such as the Taiwan Straits or the Suez Canal, entire geographic regions lose connectivity. And when such disasters happen, it's important to have information about local providers, and in order to be able to plan a response for such events, if your main provider loses completely connectivity, you need to be able to maybe find a different provider, and also this presents opportunities for big global networks to acquire new customers. So that was it, thank you. And I would take a couple of questions in the limited time.
Yeah, it was about a minute. Paul, Francis, can you come up here? And
actually,
Alin
so
can
I'm
take
going
questions,
to finish by showing you like the same time series of outages up until February 17, which shows some recovery. However, note that compared to the leftmost time series, which represents some kind of a baseline, there are still some significant number of networks that have not been recovered. So, thank you.